Imagine Christopher Columbus in the late 15th century, hunched over his charts and books, dreaming of a westward route to the riches of the East. His desk is likely cluttered with the usual references: astronomical tables, maps, and perhaps a copy of Marco Polo's account of his travels. But alongside them, another far stranger volume lies open: The Travels of Sir John Mandeville. This was a book that didn't just describe the Great Khan's court. It described islands populated by dog-headed men, headless barbarians with faces on their chests, weeping crocodiles, and the literal fountain of youth. And yet, for Columbus and generations of Europeans, this fantastical guide was treated as a serious work of reference, a reliable window into the world beyond their borders. How did this book, written by an author who almost certainly never traveled farther than a well-stocked library, become one of the most influential texts of the Middle Ages? The book opens with a disarmingly straightforward promise. The narrator introduces himself as Sir John Mandeville, born in the English town of St. Albans, who set out across the sea in 1322. His stated goal is simple and deeply resonant for a 14th century audience: to write a guidebook for pilgrims wishing to visit the Holy Land. This framing was a stroke of marketing genius, and it immediately tapped into the profound piety of the era and a lingering Crusader nostalgia. By positioning itself as a practical and spiritual guide to the center of the Christian world, the book secured an immediate and devoted audience. The author's strategy worked beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Composed in Anglo-Norman French sometime between 1350 and 1370, The Travels became an instant sensation. Its popularity was explosive and far-reaching, and within a few decades, it was translated from its original French into nearly every major European language. The most popular translations were in English, Latin, German, Italian, and Spanish. For a secular text in the age before the printing press, its dissemination was staggering. Today, around 300 manuscript copies survive, a number that dwarfs the remains of many other medieval works and testifies to its immense readership and cultural penetration. A key reason for this phenomenal success was the book's ability to satisfy a deep-seated spiritual yearning. The journey to Jerusalem was a life's ambition for many medieval Christians, but it was also a dangerous, arduous, and prohibitively expensive undertaking that few could ever attempt. The Travels offered a powerful alternative of a mental pilgrimage, where readers could imagine they were seeing all the sights they had heard about in church. But the book's appeal went far beyond the purely devotional. It presented itself as a comprehensive, up-to-date encyclopedia of the known world, a magnificent piece of popular science disguised as a personal adventure. The narrative seamlessly blends the Pilgrim's Guide with a broader geographical and cosmological treatise. Mandeville offers a clear and intelligent account of the roundness of the Earth, which, contrary to popular belief, was well known at the time. However, he went a step further and confidently asserted that it's possible to circumnavigate the globe, a radical idea for even a highly educated audience. The narrative is broadly divided into two parts. The first half is a relatively sober and believable account of the journey through Europe to Constantinople, Cyprus, Egypt, and finally the Holy Land. This section follows recognizable pilgrim itineraries and is filled with the kind of details a contemporary reader would expect. The author describes Christian relics with reverence, such as the crown of thorns and pieces of the true cross, and provides seemingly practical information about the Sultan's court in Egypt. By leaning heavily on specific, verifiable-sounding details, the author meticulously established his persona as a trustworthy, pious, and experienced traveler. After all, there were people in his readership who had legitimately conducted these journeys, and basically, it all added up. This initial part functioned to lull the reader into a state of comfort and suspended disbelief, building a foundation of credibility that the rest of the narrative would depend on. Having earned the reader's trust, the author begins to pivot, but the transition into the world of marvels is masterfully gradual. The shift isn't a sudden leap, but a slow pecking apart of the wooden dam of credibility by woodpeckers of mistrust. As the narrator's journey moved beyond the relatively well-documented Holy Land into more remote lands, the wonders of the encounters become progressively more pronounced. In the second half of the book, the narrative confidently leaves the constraints of the Pilgrim's Guide behind and blossoms into a full-blown encyclopedia of the marvelous. This is where Mandeville ventures into the lands of legend. He describes his service in the army of the Great Khan in Cathay, which is what Europeans called China at the time, offering detailed accounts of the emperor's immense power and wealth. He documents travels to the fabled Christian kingdom of Prester John, a figure of immense fascination in medieval Europe, depicted as an unimaginably rich and powerful monarch. However, these accounts are strikingly normal compared to what would come next. He tells of the Blemmies, a country of headless people whose eyes and mouths are located on their chests. He describes the Cynocephali, a surprisingly intelligent and reasonable people who happen to have the heads of dogs. We meet the monopods, who possess a single enormous foot, which they use to shield themselves from the sun's intense rays. And of course, there's Amazonia, the legendary kingdom composed entirely of fierce warrior women who live without men. For Mandeville's audience, these people and creatures weren't necessarily pure fiction. They represented the strange but plausible possibilities that might exist at the far edges of God's creation. Beyond these humanoid monsters, the book is a veritable catalog of natural and supernatural wonders. Mandeville describes the phoenix, the mythical bird of Arabia that lives for 500 years before building its own funeral pyre. He claimed that in certain regions, people live in the shells of giant snail-like creatures, in a state of comfy harmony with nature. He recounts the legend of the vegetable lamb of Tartary, a marvelous plant that grows a living lamb as its fruit, which then produced cotton. Most audaciously, he claims to have personally visited and drunk from the Fountain of Youth, which he claims to have located somewhere in the Indochina region. To a medieval reader, these monsters were far more than just sources of entertainment or horror. It was a worldview where the material world was seen as a text written by God, and every creature was imbued with symbolic and moral meaning. Perhaps the most obvious metaphorical being was the phoenix, a creature who in the medieval view was clearly a symbol for Jesus Christ. A medieval person could cite the works of John Mandeville and say, well, there's proof of the phoenix, a creature who clearly affirms faith in the divine order. Monsters represented the boundaries of the known world and the seemingly infinite creativity of the divine. They often served as allegories for human sins, or, conversely, as examples of unexpected virtue. Mandeville's treatment of these creatures is often surprisingly complex and ambiguous. For instance, the dog-headed men serve to teach the reader that they have no right to judge the creations of God. Simply put, if the Creator wants to create a rational and kind dog person, it's not your place to question it. For all its influence, modern scholarship has reached an unequivocal consensus on one thing. Sir John Mandeville, the Anglo-Norman knight, never existed in any capacity. He was a fictitious persona, a literary device created by an author who was, in all likelihood, a brilliant compiler who never traveled beyond perhaps the Holy Land. Extensive searches of contemporary English records have failed to turn up any evidence of a knight by that name who undertook such a journey. The book is not a memoir of actual experiences, but a masterful work of literary construction, a collage assembled from the writings of others. Historians have been able to construct some of the potential sources of the travels. His primary source for the travels in Asia is likely an account by the real-life Franciscan missionary Friar Odoric of Pordenone. He had traveled extensively in Persia, Central Asia, and China in the 1320s. Mandeville lifts entire sections from Odoric's sober descriptions, but then often embroiders them with fantastical details. For his descriptions of the Holy Land in Egypt, he relied heavily on a travelogue by a German knight named William of Boldensal. For general knowledge and wonders, he cribbed heavily from the massive 13th century encyclopedia Speculum Mundi by Vincent of Beauvais. But all this leaves us with the question of who the author, or perhaps more accurately, the compiler, of the travels of Sir John Mandeville was. As for this portion of the medieval mystery, a definitive answer remains elusive. The most long-standing theory points to a man named Jean de Bourgogne, a physician living in the city of Liège. According to a local chronicler, this physician confessed on his deathbed in 1372. However, there's no meaningful evidence for this other than the word of another man about this confession. Of course, the deceased man couldn't ever dispute this so-called confession, and some have speculated that the chronicler may have simply wanted to generate attention to himself. After all, the next best thing to being John Mandeville was being the person who cracked the identity of who one of the most famous medieval literary figures was. Others have suggested that it was a Flemish monk who had spent a substantial amount of time compiling travelogues into realistic anthologies. Under this theory, the travels are in essence the work of a bored monk who just wanted to have some fun and let his imagination run wild. Whatever the case, in the end, the travels of Sir John Mandeville isn't remembered as a reliable guide to the geography of 14th century Asia, but it is an unparalleled and indispensable map of the 14th century European imagination. It reveals a worldview in which the lines between the empirical and the allegorical were blurred, where geography was inseparable from morality, theology, and myth. For Mandeville and his audience, the world was a symbolic text, filled with moral lessons from God. Every creature, no matter how monstrous, and every custom, no matter how strange, had a place within this divine symbolic order. It showed these medieval Europeans that the world may be scary, but it wasn't an evil place as was commonly believed. The narrator frequently observes foreign, non-Christian societies and finds in them virtues that he believes are lacking in his own Christian Europe. Mandeville ultimately presents a feel-good world of incredible diversity, but one in which all people, regardless of their customs or appearance, are ultimately human and part of God's creation. Of course, this imaginary map had a very real impact on the physical world. Returning to Columbus for a second, we can see how the ripples of this bizarre medieval book helped pave the way for the Age of Discovery. Also, as a bit of an aside, let me know in the comments if you're interested in me posting a video where I read segments of the travels. It'll have to be from an older public domain translation, but honestly, that might add to the charm of it all. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy, just reminding you to like and subscribe, and also to share this video with your friends and family. Also, there's a new YouTube feature that allows you to hype up a video to help increase its reach, so please do me a huge favor and get on that hype train as well. Also, don't forget to check out the video podcast, Lazy Chill History, by clicking the link in the description. On the night of February 13th, 1021, the powerful ruler of the Fatimid Caliphate, Al-Hakim bi-Amir Allah, one of the most influential men in the medieval world, prepared for a journey. At 35 years old, He was the master of a vast empire that stretched across the shores of North Africa to the heart of Syria, with its glittering capital in Cairo. But this was no royal procession, and in the final years of his reign, the caliph had adopted a life of stark asceticism. He had long since abandoned the gilded silks of his ancestors for simple woolen robes, and preferred the humble gait of a donkey to a royal warhorse. His nocturnal excursions into the Mukattam hills just outside the city had become a regular solitary ritual, a time for meditation and withdrawal from the empire he commanded. That night, he rode out from Cairo's southern gates on his favorite donkey, Kamar, accompanied by only 2 attendants. The chronicler Yahya of Antioch, one of the contemporary sources to detail the event, recounts that a group of men from the Banu Qurra tribe approached the caliph, likely seeking money. Al-Hakim, known for his unpredictable generosity, dispatched one of his servants to escort some of the men to the treasury. Shortly after, he dismissed his final attendant, riding on alone into the darkness of the hills, and he was never seen again. For a few days, his absence caused little alarm in the palace. The caliph was known to disappear for short periods. But as the days stretched on, concern mounted into panic, and a large search party, composed of palace staff and loyal soldiers, was sent out to retrace his steps. Near a monastery, high on a hill, they made their first grim discovery. His loyal donkey, Kamar, had his front legs slashed by a blade, and he was unable to walk. The searchers followed the tracks of 2 men leading away from the animal until they reached a small pond east of the town of Hulwan. There they found Al-Hakim's robes, pierced with multiple dagger-like stabs, yet strangely there was no blood, and the robes were still fully buttoned. Of the caliph himself, there was no trace, and his body was never found. The evidence left behind was a mystery in itself. The slashed-up donkey and stabbed garments pointed to a violent end, yet the neatly fastened clothes seemed to contradict a chaotic struggle. To understand the mystery of Al-Hakim's end, one must first grapple with the enigma of his life. Born in Cairo in 985, he was the first of the Fatimid caliphs to be born in Egypt, the dynasty's new center of power. He ascended to the throne in 996 at the tender age of 11 and was controlled by powerful military commanders and eunuchs. However, he wasn't content being a pawn, and when he was 15, he arranged for the elimination of these powerful men who were controlling him. This brutality would be a defining feature of his reign as Fatimid Caliph, though there were significant contradictions in his personality. He founded a vast library in Cairo that offered instruction in religious topics, as well as emerging sciences such as medicine and astronomy. Yet this same enlightened patron was also a tyrant of seemingly boundless eccentricity. He issued a dizzying array of bizarre edicts, many of which were later rescinded and then reissued. For instance, he banned the consumption of a soup that had been a favorite of his rival, and according to one source, he issued an edict banning Cairo's dogs from barking. Unfortunately, you probably don't want to know how the edict was enforced on the incessant barkers, and I'll save you these sad details. In another disturbing twist, he also persecuted Christians, Jews, and Sunni Muslims during his reign. He even went so far as to order the destructions of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, an act that would later be one of the inspirations for the Crusades. Notably, destroying sites associated with Jesus angered not just the Christian world, but the Islamic world as well, since he is held to be a great prophet in this religion. Al-Hakim also took it upon himself to execute his own advisors routinely for even slight shows of disloyalty. Simply put, al-Hakim had made a very long list of enemies from a diverse range of political, social, and religious factions within his domain. Due to his completely unhinged behavior, he had become known as the Mad Caliph within his own lifetime, a moniker by which he is still remembered today. While the exact details of al-Hakim's final night remain shrouded in doubt, the historical consensus leans heavily toward one conclusion. He was likely eliminated in a carefully orchestrated palace coup. And at the center of this plot was the one person in the empire who was perhaps as formidable as the caliph himself, his older half-sister, the Princess Sit al-Mulk. Intelligent, wealthy, and politically astute, Sit al-Mulk had a deeply fraught relationship with her brother. She openly opposed his increasingly erratic and destructive policies, which she likely saw as a threat to the stability of the dynasty their father had built. Al-Hakim, in turn, was deeply paranoid and jealous of her influence, suspecting her of having lovers among his top generals. In an effort to curb her influence, he issued extreme edicts against women as a whole, though this appears to have just angered her even more. Their simmering conflict reached a boiling point in 1013 over the question of succession. Al-Hakim, in a shocking break with tradition, designated a distant cousin as his heir, completely bypassing his own young son, Ali. This was unprecedented, and for Sit al-Mulk, this was an unforgivable breach. Committed to preserving the direct line of succession, she took the young Ali and his mother into her own palace for protection, a direct and defiant challenge to the caliph's authority. This act transformed their personal rivalry into a full-blown dynastic crisis, and Sit al-Mulk had every reason to fear for her life, and every motive to act first. After the disappearance of her brother, she moved with stunning speed and precision to consolidate power. She distributed vast sums of money to court officials and military commanders to secure their loyalty. She quickly had her young nephew Ali crowned as the new caliph, with herself installed as the regent and de facto ruler of the entire empire. Then, in a final chilling move, she tied up the loose ends and had al-Hakim's chosen heir eliminated as well. Immediately after securing power, Sit al-Mulk began a complete political and social reset and quickly reversed all his edicts, especially related to religious discrimination. And yes, in case you were wondering, the dogs of Cairo were allowed to freely bark to their heart's content once again as well. Sit al-Mulk would effectively control the entire Fatimid Empire until her passing in 1023. Given that she had the most to benefit by far, and the most to lose by far, this Fatimid princess is believed by most scholars to be responsible for al-Hakim's disappearance. While this theory remains the most probable historical explanation, it's not the only one. The strange trajectory of al-Hakim's life and the lack of a body have allowed other powerful narratives to endure. The first alternative theory is that of voluntary abdication. This idea claims that al-Hakim, in his growing piety and asceticism, simply chose to abandon his throne and walk away from the world. This narrative is supported by the clear shift in his behavior during his final years. His rejection of royal finery for coarse wool, his preference for a simple donkey, and his solitary nocturnal meditations all point to a man increasingly detached from worldly power. While this theory struggles to account for the violent evidence of the injured donkey and stabbed robes, it presents a plausible end for a ruler who wanted to dismantle his royal identity. Others have speculated that he may have fallen to a threat that faced anyone in the Middle Ages: banditry. Under this theory, while he was traveling alone in humble clothing with a simple donkey, he may have been assailed by highwaymen. These individuals wouldn't have known he was the ruler of the entire Fatimid Empire, and may have mistaken him for a simple ascetic. When he was unable to pony up any goods under this theory, they simply dispatched him to cover up any evidence of their attempted crime. His body was then simply lost to both the literal sands and the sands of time. In the end, we will never know for certain what happened to this caliph, who was, at his peak, one of the most powerful people in the medieval world. Personally, though, I like to apply Occam's razor to this situation, and it's very obvious that a certain princess benefited the most from his disappearance.